Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got Mike Brazier, Ducks Unlimited waterfowl scientist from national headquarters here in Memphis. He's actually on the phone. He's in Winnipeg attending the North American Duck Symposium, I should say. And it's considered North America's most prestigious waterfowl conference. It's a gathering of waterfowl scientists, biologists. They gather every 3 years, kind of come together. They've committed to do this from a science perspective, and they get together, learn what everyone's doing. And Mike, thanks for joining me. Can you kind of explain what the Waterfowl Symposium is to people who aren't aware?
Yeah, it's one of the, from a personal perspective and professional perspective, it's one of the highlights of a, let's say, 3-year period, because as you mentioned, they occur every 3 years. Yeah. And it's very unique from the perspective of it's a conference of all these professionals, academicians, and habitat managers, waterfowl biologists, and a lot of graduate students as well that are studying waterfowl ecology across North America that come together under the banner of a single taxonomic group, and that being it's called the North American Duck Symposium. And while ducks are indeed the focus of this conference, there are a number of presentations and posters and talks and discussions about geese and swans, and so it's not exclusively about ducks, but they're definitely the focus. Sort of incidentally, I will mention that also every so often there is the North American Arctic Goose Conference. Yeah. As well as the Sea Duck Conference. And so those two groups of waterfowl also sort of have their own little conference that's held occasionally. But it's a phenomenal gathering for professionals in this field. As you mentioned, it's just the preeminent conference of this type for this field. And it really is an opportunity for the scientific community that studies this resource to get re-energized, to learn about all the new things that are happening, and to get an update on some of the results that are coming out from new projects, and also to reconnect with a lot of our colleagues and our friends and our partners. And so it's just a really neat opportunity for us all, and a lot of good comes out of it. Yeah,
you mentioned that, one thing that you kind of wanted to point out was, this just shows just a fantastic commitment to the science. And, that's one thing that, Ducks Unlimited members and some of our listeners may be interested in, is just knowing, that background science that goes into everything that you guys do. Kind of explain that, just kind of the sharing of ideas and the commitment from even the organization.
Yeah, that is a really neat aspect of our waterfowl management community. And I've attended a number of these conferences, and I've had the opportunity to interact with people from different backgrounds that occasionally will be invited to present as a guest, and then maybe they come from the climatological background, or they come from the medical background, or something of that nature. And they come to this conference, and I've heard on numerous occasions remarks about how amazed they are and how impressed they are at the level of collaboration and cooperation among academic researchers, among federal researchers and state researchers and biologists. A lot of times in the academic community, you think about people being really guarded with the work, with their own work, because they like that proprietary information, they like that recognition. But the waterfowl management community, and to be honest, a lot of the other natural resource communities, management communities, are much the same way, where there's just a tremendous amount of collaboration. And those guests that often attend just remark about that. And they say, I just can't believe how much sharing of ideas, sharing of knowledge, and how willing researchers are to work with one another and share these things that they're learning. And I think, to me, that's a reflection, number one, the fact that this is a shared resource. Migratory waterfowl are a shared resource across states, across provinces and countries. But there's also just something really close-knit about this waterfowl management community, where we all share a passion for it, and we realize that none of us can do it alone, because they are such a shared transboundary resource. And so that's a really neat aspect of this. And I think it's important for anyone that cares about the waterfowl resource to know that the states, the individual countries, and they're not working in isolation. We're all working together on these things, and this conference is just another example of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone through, kind of looked and see what some of the speakers were talking about on the different days, and it's, just from an organizational and, government standpoint, I mean, it's state agencies. You've got Ducks Unlimited Canada, Delta Waterfowl, just Canadian Wildlife Agency. I mean, there's so many different, just fantastic participants here. But let's get into some of those, some of the different sessions. I know, I believe Dr. Tom Moorman gave a presentation today.
He sure did.
And can you kind of walk through that? I know we can probably get Tom on to talk about that at some point, but can you kind of talk about a little bit of what he was presenting today?
Absolutely, and that could be and should be a podcast in and of itself. And
absolutely.
So first, I will say each morning this conference runs for 4 full days, at least, of presentations and posters, and it kicks off every morning, and the entire morning session is devoted to what we call the plenary session, and there's usually a dedicated session around usually one topic, one central topic, and it's the only thing that's occurring at that time, and so all the attendees are able to listen, to sit in on this conference and listen and participate. And we, Tom and I and other colleagues, had submitted an idea for a plenary related to an issue that's received a lot of attention here recently. It's actually received a lot of attention dating all the way back to the 30s when you really dig into the books. But it's this notion of changing distributions of waterfowl during the non-breeding season, and how that may be related to all sorts of different factors, and then how those distributional changes intersect with our hunting community. And so anyone that hunted this past year will know that there were some things that weren't quite like most years. And we had some really crazy weather. We had some an abundant rainfall, and so that sort of stimulated some additional discussion this winter and spring. And we saw an opportunity to advance that conversation by way of a plenary session at this conference. And so we submitted the idea. It was accepted, and so we had a pretty neat lineup. We had Dr. Tom Moorman kicking off with sort of an overview of this notion of distributional changes in waterfowl during migration and really the winter period. And so he approached that from an evolutionary standpoint, why birds are really adapted for those changes, and then what are the different things that can motivate those changes through time. And so it's I don't want to get into too much detail because, like I say, that's
we're
something
going to have to do that. Yeah, we'll do that as a standalone for sure.
What I will say is that we had a really neat lineup there. We had Tom kicking it off. The second person that presented was Dr. Mike Schumer from Syracuse University, and they're sort of at the leading edge of trying to understand the effects of climate, long-term climate, and short-term annual variation in weather, namely temperature and snow cover, and how it affects movements of ducks north and south through the flyways, and then. Following Dr. Schumer, we had Dr. Frank Rower, the president and chief scientist of Delta Waterfowl, talking about some sort of the demographics of waterfowl populations and the impacts that may have on hunter success and harvest. And then that session was concluded by Dale Humberg, former chief scientist of Ducks Unlimited Incorporated. And it was a really, and Dale is great at this, it was a really neat presentation on sort of the interface between waterfowl hunters and then the habitat and how those things relate to one another. And it spoke a lot about how each of those can affect one another, and really what do managers have the ability to control, and what do we wish we had the ability to control. And it's a fascinating topic, and it's a topic that every waterfowl hunter and really anyone that cares about waterfowl can appreciate, because they see waterfowl change in response to climate and weather. They see waterfowl change, and whether it be within year movements or whether it be changes longer term, they see how changes on the landscape can result in changes in the distribution and composition of all the waterfowl that they're seeing out there. And so, we have a lot of information out there, but it's not really hasn't been brought together in a very comprehensive fashion. But then there are a lot of other things that we just still don't know once you break it down to individual species. So like I said, that's a topic that we can get farther into detail on, but it went very well this morning.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
I mentioned just looking at the brochure that I was interested in a stopover duration and habitat use of spring migrating dabbling ducks in the Wabash River Valley. I only say that because I'm from, grew up hunting the Wabash River, and I'm like, man, that I'd like to sit in and listen to that. And then you kind of brought up, you sat in on one that was actually at the same time as that. And can you kind of explain that? And it was a Canada goose focus. It was
given by a student, and that's one of the other things that I want to emphasize is I think the number of attendees this year is somewhere in the 200 to 300 range, and usually we get attendance of 300 to 400. I think there were some travel restrictions this year and travel challenges that some of our state partners had, and maybe some of our federal partners in the states, and so attendance might be down a little bit this year. But what I want to point out is about a third of the attendees here are graduate students. And that's really, really important, because those are the next professionals. And this is an opportunity for those students to hone their skills, to get experience presenting. Public speaking is something that's really intimidating for a lot of people, but it's also really, really important in this business, because we as managers and conservationists interface with the public so often. So this is an opportunity for them to develop and hone those skills. And so I was attending this other presentation being delivered by a student because I had the opportunity to help judge this student. We provide awards, student presentation awards. And so that's why I was in this other session. And there was a habitat use and movements of urban nesting Canada geese in Toronto. And this urban nesting Canada geese is a phenomenon that a lot of people will be familiar with. And so what this student had done is mark these Canada geese with these neck collars that provide locations down at a really fine scale. They have little GPS trackers in these collars, and they communicate with the cell towers to get the data and all this. The technology the advancements that have been made are really, really impressive. And so what this student was able to do is follow those Canada geese through their nesting period and to look at the different movements that successful breeders and failed breeders had. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the more notable things that he documented, and it's been documented before, but it's always just fascinating to see this stuff, is that approximately a quarter of the Canada geese that were unsuccessful with their breeding attempt flew north about 2,000 kilometers north to the sort of the northern extent of Hudson Bay to molt, to go through their flight list. But they engaged in this molt migration, which a lot of people have probably heard of. And it's just incredibly amazing to think that these birds would do that. And then whenever they come back, so they go up north 2,000 kilometers and they come back, and some of the birds, when they're coming back, they're exposed to hunting pressure. A couple of his birds got shot. Yeah. And then there's about 3/4 of the birds that stay there in Toronto and are never subjected to any hunting pressure, at least during that time. Eventually they'll head south, and they are all those birds eventually get out of Toronto during the winter, or most of them anyway, and then they will be exposed to hunting. Actually, one of the other things he pointed out was about 55% of the harvest of those birds from the Greater Toronto area are harvested in the States.
Oh, wow. So, and kind of explain just real quick, because you mentioned that, the significant number of birds going up way north to the Hudson Bay to molt. Kind of explain what that molt migration is real quick. Just kind of a brief rundown of what the molt migration is?
Well, it's a phenomenon where a lot of the Canada geese won't nest until they're a couple or 3, maybe 4 years old, and so those non-breeders will kind of take off in the summer, as well as those individuals. Some of them that failed in their nesting attempt, and they'll go to some other location, presumably because historically or even currently some of these northern wetlands provide more stable water levels, wetland conditions that provide them greater security and protection from predators and any other kind of factors that they may be exposed to during that flightless period, because waterfowl go through a simultaneous wing molt. They drop all of their flight feathers at the same time. So these birds literally cannot fly for about 30 days. So it obviously behooves them on their survival side of things to be in an area where there's reliable water, there's reliable food, and they can hide from predators or any other kind of risk. And so that's some of these urban Canada geese will fly north to some of these larger molting areas. And the other thing that kind of happens there is they can mix with these populations of Canada geese that do in fact nest at more northern latitudes, and so then that through the years has led to all sorts of efforts to understand the individual movement dynamics of these subpopulations of breeding Canada geese at northern latitudes. And it's a really neat phenomenon. It's just crazy to think that they would develop that pattern.
Yeah. No, that's just great science too. Just the fact that there are people out there focusing on something like that, as urban nesting Canada geese in Toronto, it is specific, but it also has probably larger ramifications than everyone sees. Local, not everyone, but a lot of people in the U.S. are seeing, local nesting geese and these birds that maybe are sticking around urban areas a little longer than they would in the past. And I think people are just seeing them. But all these are great. All these topics, we could probably go on for about 3 hours just for the fact that I'm looking at other, everything from Arctic goose nesting to helicopter waterfowl surveys and, PPR research in Iowa. Just some really cool stuff. But no, I appreciate you joining me today and kind of filling everyone in on what the symposium is and what the commitment to science that all you guys are doing now and how, waterfowl hunters and DU members can now know exactly where some of the science is coming from. Yeah.
One other thing I want to share, if I can, it was one of the more interesting things that I've heard so far. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. It's always fun and exciting to see the advancements in technology and how much additional information they can provide for our understanding of waterfowl ecology. But there's a particular application of technology that we heard about this week dealing with cavity nesting wood ducks. And I'll try to be brief on this. And basically what the researcher out in California has done is he's used these pit tags. You've heard about people pit tagging their pets, their dog or their cat, just these little devices that are uniquely coated. And so they can insert those subcutaneously under the skin of these wood ducks. And they can even do that when they're ducklings. And so then they can install these RFID readers, basically that read the pit tags on the side of the wood duck boxes. And so they've done this for a number of years in this rather closed population of wood ducks out in California. And they have this phenomenal data set showing the movements, the cavity use by individual wood ducks, and wood ducks that hatched from this female and wood ducks that were hatched from, and so you have this familial lineage that's sort of being developed. But the one thing that was so incredible to learn about is that these data showed that many of these female wood ducks will visit up to 20 to 40 wood duck boxes in a single breeding season. It's just nuts to see this data showing that. So you have an individual wood duck that may visit 20 to 30 nest boxes.
So they're just looking for suitability, or?
Some of them are going to be laying their eggs in these nests. And that's the other thing that they found is they can go in and they can genetically identify they can identify the genetic, signature, if you will. They can identify which hen is responsible for laying which egg, and there's just so much mixing of the eggs, and just within individual nest boxes, you'll have multiple hens that will lay an egg in the nest boxes. And then you have some nest boxes that are visited by 40 different hens.
Wow.
It's just real. And previously, our thought was that nest boxes might have been visited by only 2 or 3 hens. And that an individual hen, if she was nesting in a box, maybe she was committed to that nest box. But these data are telling us something completely different. It's just incredible to see some of this stuff. And that's one of the things sort of going forward that the technology allows us to do, is understand how individual birds are so different in their behaviors, different in their productivity, different in their survival. And that is really an exciting frontier in the waterfowl ecology and science field. And so that's really, that's what I look forward to kind of going forward about all this, what technology allows us to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, you talk about waterfowl and ecology and everything every day, and probably have for many, many years, but it's pretty awesome when you as a waterfowl scientist can sit there and have a aha moment. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And there's always a management application to this work. That's the other unique element to this, is that nearly every one of these presentations will have some link to management. What does it mean? On the surface, you may not think that information that I just described is very important, but as we begin to understand how individual females are more beneficial or more productive than others, I mean, then it begins to help us understand in a fundamentally different way how waterfowl populations operate, and then we can apply that to our understanding of how certain activities, whether it be harvest or whether it be habitat management, how that may then translate into the benefits among that different group of hens. And so it's just the management application of this is also it's always there, and that's something that's also very rewarding, and I hope that our listeners appreciate.
Oh, I'm sure they do. Mike, I appreciate it. Thanks for joining me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Good talking with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.